So while playing on the World of Warcraft Classic Beta client, I'm here in Ironforge right now, by the way, in the Forlorn Cavern, I made an interesting observation that I think is important for people, especially with low-end systems or older laptops that want to play Classic WoW. So in the top left, we can see my GPU usage is around, let's say, 50 to 55%, and my CPU usage is hovering between maybe 15 to 18%, and my frame rate is sitting at roughly 350 to 360 frames per second. And in the center of the screen, we can also see the in-game WoW frame rate counter, which seems to be a bit higher and fluctuating pretty rapidly. But again, it seems to cap out at maybe 400 on the upper end, but for the most part seems to be around the 350 to 360 average range. So this is my current frame rate. Now if I turn off the UI, I want you to watch my frame rate, especially in the top left, this 350 to 360 range we're hitting, and watch what happens when I turn off the UI. So now, our top left frame rate is hitting pretty consistently above 400 frames per second, and our blizzard counter in the center is now consistently above 400 and almost hitting 450 sometimes. Now it still fluctuates a lot, but it's pretty obvious between these two that the frame rate has increased quite a bit by turning off the UI. We're talking maybe a 50 frames per second increase. Now I could have done a more thorough average test, but for now this is a quick study. I am doing a larger test of a lot of hardware on the Classic client, and hopefully I'll have a video out in the next week or two, so you might want to stay tuned for that. But initially we can see that the UI is having a significant impact on the game's frame rate. Now if we go back to the standard UI, it's hard to tell here, but what I think is happening is that my CPU usage is fairly low, right? So I'm using 15 to 18% of my processing power, and that's while recording this video at a high bit rate. If I turn off my recording, my frame rate, my CPU usage is under 10%. So as it turns out, Classic WoW is running on DirectX 11, not DirectX 12. So when BFA launched, around that time, DirectX 12 was ported into the modern WoW client, and with that, Blizzard engineered some improvements to the way that the game scales to more than one processor, or more than one core. And currently, the Classic client, unfortunately, seems to almost entirely rely on a single thread. So if you have a quad-core CPU, only one of those cores is really going to be used heavily on the Classic client. But if you're playing BFA, you're going to really be seeing 2 to 4 or more possibly, but about 4 threads being actively used by the game client, which is great for modern systems. But that's not the case here. So it's hard to tell, but when I looked through individual cores and threads, what I would see is that switching from the UI on to the UI off causes that single thread that's being heavily used to decrease in usage. And as that CPU usage drops a little bit, it allows my GPU to kind of stretch its legs and generate higher frames per second. So what I'm saying is the UI is largely CPU dependent. And however, because the client only really uses a single thread, although my global CPU usage is very low, I have a single thread that is pegged at a fairly high percentage, and when I drop the UI, that drops down a little bit, and then the GPU is no longer bottlenecked, and the GPU can now push farther and get us a higher frame rate. This is an important note for systems that have a lower end hardware setup, so if you have a lower CPU or GPU, you might be able to get a little bit more of a stretch by limiting how much you have on your UI. And as an example for this, right now again, we're sitting at about 360, 370 frames per second with the UI on. If I open up my bags, open up a character frame, and let's say I open up the quest log, we'll now see my frame rate has dropped to around 300 to 320 frames per second. So again, the more UI you have on screen, the worse your frame rate will be, assuming you are CPU limited. Now if you have a really bad GPU, a very, very old graphics card, and a very, very fast single core performance processor, such as, let's say, an 8700K or 9700K, you may find that you're actually not really CPU limited severely, depending on the graphics card configuration. But I think most systems will find that they are limited by their single core performance. So the point being here, if you're on an older system and you want to play Classic WoW, I strongly encourage you to minimize extra stuff on your UI. If you add other add-ons in, it will also probably further decrease your frame rate due to the CPU usage. So really keep it as simple and as clean as possible. Even running around with your character frame open, you can see here, if I close my bags, close my character frame, and close my quest log, my frame rate goes back up. So this is just a quick report. I wanted to kind of share this for people that are maybe trying to run the Classic Beta client on older hardware. Minimize your UI, it's going to help, I think. I found that this frame rate disparity can be anywhere from 20 to 100 frames, and in some of my older systems that I'm running, I see maybe a 2 frame rate difference. So it really depends significantly on whether you are GPU or CPU limited, but it is something worth testing out for yourself, and maybe this will give you some guidance in deciding whether or not it's worth having a lot of extra UI or add-ons, or whether minimizing is better, especially on older hardware. Anyway, like I said, I have a larger video coming out with a significant amount of hardware testing. I'm trying to plot out what is sort of the optimal system in terms of minimum spec requirements. That should be out in the next week or two, but for now, that's all for today. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.